the console wars had begun. The NES was king. Sega was making waves with the debut of the Genesis, and Hudson Soft would release their new system, the TurboGrafx-16. First launched in Japan as a PC engine, Hudson had intended but failed to sell their design to Nintendo as their new system. Eventually, they teamed up with the Nippon Electric Company, or NEC, to create the 16 as an alternative to the Big Two.
Between Mario and Sonic at the time in the late 80s, 90s, it was a street fight.
It was one of a time where no one had really considered a console war, but that's what was happening.
You one of us or one of them?
Originally advertised as the first 16-bit game console, the TurboGrafx was actually an 8-bit system.
Their graphics chip was 16-bit, so what you had were fairly eye-dropping visuals for the time with the same sort of 8-bit gameplay in terms of processing power.
The 16 was priced at $200, came with a single controller that could toggle turbo settings, and was boxed with a copy of Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, an anime-based side-scroller. Initially, the system sold decently in big cities like New York and LA, but struggled to catch on in the rest of the country.
It was a weird experience because no one actually had a TurboGrafx-16. It was always a friend of a guy that somebody knows.
Game cartridges were about the size of a credit card, and the console could only physically support one D-pad.
An issue with the TurboGrafx-16 was that it had one controller port in it, which meant if you wanted to play with your little brother or your friends, you had to buy an extra peripheral.
A year after its launch, NEC released the first CD add-on, the TurboGrafx CD.
And I just remember the music being so incredible and the sound effects sounding real, and that, at its time, was pretty cool.
However, its additional $400 price tag turned away most consumers.
It's one of those things that, like, yeah, we can all pretend that it's revolutionary and great, but if nobody can afford to experience it, what's the point?
Despite this, the TurboGrafx-16 would help launch several titles and cult classics like R-Type, the space adventure shoot-'em-up, the brawler Fighting Street, or as it would later be known, Street Fighter, and the horror fest Splatterhouse, which, due to its violent and gory nature, would become one of the first games to ever receive a parental advisory. However, the TurboGrafx-16's most popular and enduring franchise would be Bonk, the side-scrolling caveman who eventually became the console's mascot.
I remember a little dude with a giant noggin, and you'd run around and you'd leap and you would headbutt things. And that was their crazy twist on the gameplay. You guys like that Mario thing, right? Where you jump and your feet kill the enemy? Well, get this. We're taking that idea and turning it on its head. Literally. I bet that was the pitch meeting.
Over the next few years, NEC would release updated models of the TurboGrafx with increased memory and speed. However, these would fail to gain any ground on Sega or Nintendo.
It didn't have the brand recognition. It was incredibly expensive. The CD peripheral was even more expensive, and it just didn't have a lot of the must-have games that drove sales of the other systems.
The TurboGrafx would only go on to sell about 2.5 million consoles in the US, compared to the Genesis and Super Nintendo, which would sell between 20 to 30 million each.
There's an easy thing that was behind the lack of success of the TurboGrafx-16. No one bought it.
Though games continued to be developed in Japan until 1999, ultimately the TurboGrafx-16 would never find its place in the US.
It did spawn a few decent games and really help champion a couple franchises, but ultimately, it will be remembered as the system that you emulate on your Nintendo.